Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the inaugural Rebuilding Macroeconomics Complexity in Macroeconomics prize giving. My name is Angus Armstrong. I am Director of Rebuilding Macroeconomics, and we are an ESRC research network hosted by the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, which is this rather beautiful building behind me in Smith Square in London. When we were about halfway through the initial project, we were having a discussion about how we can promote more research on complexity, particularly as it relates to macroeconomics. We were actually at the OECD, one of the new approaches to economic challenges, one of their excellent conferences, and we were having a discussion in the wings, and a friend, Penny Mealy, came out with the idea, well, why don't we have a competition? Which I thought was a great idea. What was quite interesting is that this was thought to be quite a radical solution to the problem. Since we've had the competition, a lot of people asked us, why we decided to go this way. It's very reassuring to see there's quite a few competitions beginning to appear. So perhaps we started something, but it was an experiment. If I'm honest, I expected maybe 10 to 15 applications, papers to be submitted, maybe a little bit more than that. In the end, we got 26 applications. And of all of those applications, I'd say maybe 2 were really were never going to win anything. Just whittling them down into a short list of 10 was actually quite hard work. And I read them all. And there were some excellent papers. So right across the board, there were some very, very good papers. And I want to thank everybody very much indeed who applied. We're extremely grateful. And as I say, I thought there were some really great papers. It was very hard work making the final decisions. Luckily, for everybody concerned, the final decisions didn't come down to me. We had 3 sort of recognized experts in complexity theory who have published many, many papers between them. And so they very generously gave up their time and came to a consensus on the first 3 places. And the point of this afternoon is, first of all, to announce those first 3 places, but then to hear from one of the authors to present the ideas. So let me first of all do the first bit in terms of the prizes. The first prize went to Sebastian Poledna and Michael Gregor Mies, who are both at the Institute for Ecological Economics at Vienna University in this beautiful city, Vienna. So many, many congratulations to you, and we look forward to hearing your paper. The second prize was to Valentina Semenova and Julian Winkler, both at Oxford University, I think in different departments, one in economics and one in the Oxford Martin School. So very well done, Valentina and Julian. And the third prize goes to Anton Pichler and Marco Pengallo, Maria del Rio Chanona, Francois Lafond, and Doyne Farmer. For a paper about COVID, which I think I first read in June of last year. And I still think for the time that it was produced and the policy message that he gave, I thought was a really fantastic piece of work. So let me say extremely well done to all 3 authors. I've missed somebody off that list, I've just realized. In the first prize, Kars Homs was also one of the co-authors. Excuse me, Kars. It's just the way that my paper has been written here, so excuse me for that. So congratulations to all of you. May I also thank the judges very much indeed for all of their work in helping us. And just to reiterate, to all of the 26 entrants, it was something which we hope to run again next year at the same time, because if we can stimulate this sort of research, then I think everybody benefits. So that's the sort of prize giving part of it. We've now asked each of one author from each of the papers to present the paper. They're going to speak for 20 minutes, and my job is to keep them on time, which is never an easy task, but I'll do my best. In order that we can have 10 minutes discussion after each paper. and then have a discussion overall after all 3 papers. Now, for people who are watching the audience who want to join in the discussion, there's a chat function. I'm sure you all know this by now. If you just open the chat function and type in your comments there, then I'll collect them as we go through, and we'll either invite you to come in. So Carla, my colleague, will sort of get in touch with you, or I'll read out your questions. So please do feel free to ask as many questions as you wish. They're extremely welcome. So without any further notices, can I first of all pass over to Sebastian to present your winning paper. Sebastian, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm very happy to be here and present our paper on economic forecasting with an agent-based model. Before I start, I have to make a small correction. So I'm not affiliated with the Institute of Ecological Economics at the University of Economics and Business in Vienna. I'm a scientist at JASA in Austria, where I lead a exploratory modeling research group, which does not only work on like advancing macroeconomic models, but also deals many other interesting topics such as climate models and so on. So the work that I present here today, so these are the results of a multi-year long research project. So this is why I'm very excited that we received this award and to present this work here today. So why we work on agent-based modeling? So when I give these presentations, I really like to show this plot that I show here, because this explains, in my opinion, motivates this work very well, in my opinion. So this plot shows the range of GDP forecasts in the UK in 2007, before the financial crisis. If I remember correctly, this plot contains 27 forecasts of various institutes in the UK. And then this plot also shows what actually happened in reality. So as you can see, none of the 27 official models that were used in the UK before the crisis had any idea of what was to come. So in general, when we started this work, so the hope was that agent-based models can complement current suite of macroeconomic models, and they could be of some help to make sense of these extreme kinds of movements, and also in general can improve things like economic forecasting or policy analysis in general. So I was not exactly sure what the audience will be and how many of you are familiar with agent-based models in economics. I thought to also include a general slide on ABMs. So in general, agent-based economic models explain the evolution of an economy by simulating the micro-level behavior of individual agents in an economy to give a macro-level picture. So I thought the best way to distinguish ABMs from other models would be to show you a comparison. So this is why I made this table, the comparison. So I don't mean to put models here into boxes. So don't be offended if you work, for example, on a heterogeneous agent model that doesn't fit here in this simple comparison. So what I'm trying here is to compare typical ABM with basic DSGE model, for example. So ABMs in general have heterogeneous agents, where DSGE models typically have representative agents, and then ABMs So this is, I think, an important distinction. So they're typically solved numerically on a computer at the agent level. So one behavioral rule at a time, while DSGE models, for example, are solved on the aggregate level. In ABMs, you typically have some assumption of bounded rationality and expectations of various forms, while in DSGE model, one assumes rational or model consistent expectations. Another important distinction is typically in ABMs, one assumes that agents use simple heuristics, and they typically involve a number of free parameters, which is also something where ABMs are frequently criticized for. And in DSGE models, you rather assume that agents optimize given their expectations. And as typical results of ABMs match moments and reproduce various stylized facts, while DSGE models match often historical evolution of macro variables. And one key innovation of our work that I present here is so that we also developed an ABM that can go beyond reproducing stylized facts with our ABM. So we are also able to match historical evolution of variables and to show that this can be used for economic forecasting, for example. I also want to quote a friend of mine, Doyle Farmer here, who inspired us to do this work. And he said already in 2009, so in principle, it might even be possible to create an agent-based economic model capable of making useful forecasts to real economy. Although this is ambitious, just like climate modeling, it's a huge undertaking. This is basically what we try to do with this work that I present here today. So in our work in economic forecasting with an agent-based model, so we basically did two things. So we developed an agent-based model that can compete with benchmark VR and DSGE models in out-of-sample forecasting of macro variables. And then we demonstrated this model for the Austrian economy, and for that we calibrated the model parameters with micro and macroeconomic data from the Austrian economy in such a way that we have a one-to-one representation between the model and data, so that we have a representation in the model of basically every household, every business, every institution in Austria. So we have a model with close to 9 million agents representing every citizen of the country. So I give here a short overview of our key modeling choices and mechanisms of the agent-based model. And then in the next couple of slides, I will give you a few details on important processes, but in this short presentation, I cannot go through the entire model. So our agent-based model includes all sectors in the economy. So this includes financial, non-financial firms, households, and the general government. And these sectors are populated with millions of heterogeneous agents. So then, important aspect of this work, so we relax assumption of rational expectations in this work with adaptive learning. I will say a bit more on this in the next slide. Another important aspect how the model is that in general, in this approach, so the stocks affect the flows in the model. And this is very typical for agent-based models. So the model has decentralized markets that are modeled in a bottom-up way, which allows for various frictions. So for example, trade frictions. The model includes a complete GDP identity, and it also incorporates financial frictions with a financial accelerator and debt finance investment in the model. Important aspect is that the model allows nonlinear responses, which are typically underestimated by linearized DSGE models. And the model also allows for the possibility of endogenous economic crisis without any need for an exogenous shock. And key aspect of this work is we validate our model based on the comparison of its forecast performance with that of other approaches like econometric or DSGE models, for example. So to give you like some details and show a few equations of the model. So the first is on expectation formation in the model. So we use adaptive learning in the model. So the agent's expectations are modeled by adaptive learning, where agents act like econometricians who estimate the parameters of their models and then make forecasts using their estimates. For that approach, so we follow the approach of Holmes and Tu, where agents learn optimal parameters of a parsimonious A1 rule. And then with these forecasts expectations on economic growth, the model are formed using an A1 model where the parameters are re-estimated every period during the model simulation. So then, as I said before, so in general, in the model, the stocks affect the flows. So this is true for all financial variables in the model, and then also for variables for the real economy side. So I show here as an example output. So firms in the model produce output via intermediate inputs, labor, and a capital stock with a fixed coefficient Leontief technology. And there, the technologically determined input coefficients are obtained from input-output tables. Then for the supply choice, the expectation and demand, the firms form expectation about future economic growth according to the AR1 process that I described in the slide before. And then each firm in the model adapts a desired scale of activity according to the previous demand assumption about economic growth, and then also about the inventory levels. So that we include in the version of the model an inventory cycle, for example. So then another important aspect of this approach is that we have various decentralized markets in the model that allow for frictions, for example, for trade frictions. So on demand, so each firm in the model experiences demand from various consumers. And this can be households, but this also includes, for example, intermediate consumption from other firms. There, the level of demand will be determined by consumers only after a firm has set its price and carried out the production, and is subject to a search and matching mechanism that specifies which consumers are visiting a firm. And then the sales are the realized demand dependent on the supply available from a firm only after the production process has been carried out. So we have fundamental uncertainty in the model. I think this is a good example to show that. So when I briefly summarized the model, I think I also mentioned that the model includes a complete GDP identity. I wanted to show here explicitly how GDP, the model economy, can be calculated. So GDP can be calculated, the model, according to the three approaches: production approach, the expenditure approach, and also the income approach. For example, in the production approach, you can see GDP is calculated from total sales of goods and services from all firms. And I wanted to make this explicit here, so I wrote the actual number of firms that we have in the model for a specific calibration period. And then also GDP can be calculated, for example, with the expenditure approach, where we have household consumption, government consumption, and capital formation, and changes in inventories, export and imports, and so on. And there you can see, I also wanted to make this explicit here. We have close to 9 million consumers in the model that represent each citizen of country of Austria. So the next couple of slides, I want to show you few results from our paper, from the forecasting exercise that we did with the agent-based model. So the first example is on the out-of-sample forecast performance in comparison to VAR model. So I show here in this table the root mean squared error statistics for main aggregates from ABM simulation in comparison to a VR1 model for the forecast period from second quarter of 2010 to the last quarter of 2016 for Austrian economy. In the table I show as macro variables, I show GDP, inflation, government consumption, exports and imports, and then also the GDP for the euro area, inflation for the euro area, and for interest rates, the Euribor. And then I show the root mean square error statistics for different forecast horizons for VAR model that was estimated on the same time series. So we used for the estimation of the agent-based model. I show the statistics from 1 quarter, 2 quarters up to 12 quarters ahead for both models. And then I show in comparison, I show percentage gains or losses relative to the VR1 model for the ABM. So I don't think I will comment here on every variable. So just as an example, for GDP, you can see, so for in the short term, so there's not much of an improvement of the ABM, but then over longer time horizons, up to 12 quarters, you can see relatively large performance gain in the forecasting performance of the agent-based model. And this holds in general for the other variables as well. So because this is an agent-based model, so we can also disaggregate variables for the forecasting exercise. So here I show, for example, the out-of-sample forecast performance of sectoral cross-value added in the model. This time in comparison to AR1 models. And yeah, you can see, so for several sectors. The agent-based model shows some improvement again in the longer time horizons, and then typically, so this typically involves like the manufacturing sector, the construction sector, also the trade sectors, and then for some smaller sectors, so this type of model is maybe not so useful. So typically in the agricultural sector, the model doesn't show great performance, but this sector is probably not so important for the economies and maybe not really subject to market forces like the other sectors. Yeah, then I also want to show you one example where we conducted conditional forecasts with the model. So here I'm showing conditional forecast performance of the ABM in comparison to a DSGE model. So in this time I show some plots so that you can also see visual comparison, the forecasting performance. So as a DSGE model that we used here as a comparison, we use DSGE model that is very closely related to the standard Smets and Waters DSGE model from 2007. So we only used here an adapted version for the Euro area and the Austrian economy for this comparison. And because we are doing here conditional forecasts, so these forecasts are conditional on exports and imports and also on government consumption. So in these figures, I show the ABM in the black line, DSG model as the red line, and in blue I show comparison in year one model. In the shaded areas, one standard deviation, and the dashed line shows the observed data from Eurostat for these 3 years. I think I will not go much more into detail, but for examples in the quarterly forecast for GDP, you can see the conditional forecasts here, the ABM are very close to the observed data, show some improvements over the other models. Yeah, so in the last part of my short presentation, I also want to give you some overview of applications and other projects around this paper that we are currently doing. So the first project that I'm showing you is on the computational side of this work. So over the last 2 years or so, I'm collaborating with colleagues from the University of Tokyo, and there our goal was to re-implement this work in such a way that we can harness the computational resources that are available. And this is the first paper that came out from this collaboration, so where we re-implemented the ABM in such a way that we can use the fastest supercomputers that are available to humanity. And with that work, so we can extend this model from the small open economy setting also to large economies, where we have already done this. So for example, for the Japanese economy, we also have now a version for the Euro area, for example. Then another application that I briefly want to mention is in the beginning of the current economic crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, we used the agent-based model calibrated for the Austrian economy in what is basically the first application where we used the model to do flash projections in the COVID-19 crisis. So very early on in the pandemic, basically when it hit Europe in the beginning of 2020, when we had the first shutdowns here in Europe, we did projections for 3 years ahead. We were really happy about that. So we could show as one of the first groups in Austria that the recovery will take much longer. And so far, the projections that we made more than a year ago are very close to what actually happened. Yeah, in the last application of the model that I want to mention is on forecasting financial crisis with this agent-based model. So we were always interested in, from the beginning, if this modeling approach and this technology can be used to learn more and understand better these large economic shocks that we saw about a decade ago. And for this project, we have calibrated the ABM for the euro area. And what I show here is forecasts of the ABM for a version that is calibrated with data until from the last quarter of 2006. And then here I show forecasts of the ABM in comparison again to an AR1 and the DSGE model for 3 years ahead, so a period that includes financial crisis. And there you can see, which I found really interesting when I saw this the first time, so that with the kind of agent-based model, so you actually observe endogenous economic crisis in the model without the need of any exogenous shocks. If you think like maybe this plot looks too good to be true, so this is, so I don't want to overstate my claim here. So what we are seeing is with the data from that period, we see an endogenous economic crisis forming in the model, but it typically forms around the time of the financial crisis. But I don't want to overstate the claim that with this model we could actually predict exactly when a financial crisis would happen. But nevertheless, I find it very interesting that you can have in a macroeconomic model endogenous economic crisis without exogenous shocks. So with that, I would like to conclude my talk, but before I do that, I would like to take this opportunity to thank everybody who helped, supported, and inspired us for this work that we did over many years. I'm very grateful for all the comments, help, everything that we have received. And I also, I'm also very grateful for the funding that we received for this research from YASA, who funded this project over many years. As I said in the beginning, also many thanks again for awarding us this prize. And
you're welcome, Sebastian. Let's keep a few minutes for questions, but thank you very much indeed. We've got many questions, so I want to go to those. Where we had a question from Michael Hatcher from Southampton University, who said, who is estimating those parameters? Oh, on the last slide, that's not terribly helpful, but about some parameters, I guess, early on. They seem not to be agent specific, hence a representative forecaster, question mark. So that's one question. I'd also like to ask the expectations model formulation. So you got rid of rational expectations and had this adaptive model. Did you look at other ones first, or was there a principal reason for choosing that one? So perhaps you could start off with those two, and then there's a couple of other questions. And feel free to ask your co-authors to answer as well.
Okay, so maybe I start to answer, and then Kars, maybe you could join in. So in this version, so we have, so one could assume like economic forecasts for the economy in general. There's also, so we also have a version of the model where we let firm agents do their own forecasting. I don't have the plot here. I could look it up and show it later if you're interested. Because it's a very interesting picture. So you see then when each firm is doing their own forecast, and you see that firms with adaptive learning learn from each other and adjust their forecasts over time to improve their forecast, and this also improves the overall forecast for the economy then. It's a model output.
Okay, great. Megan Green, I'm not sure if Megan's able to ask this question. Is she? Or?
There was a second part of the question. Maybe Kars.
Kars, are you going to come in on the expectations?
Okay, thank you. Let me first say thank the organizers for this prize. It's a great recognition, particularly for my young co-authors, Sebastian and Michael, who have invested years and years and years in this research. So thanks a lot for that. It's great. On expectations, the funny thing was, I remember when I discussed with Sebastian an early version of the paper, he had this AR1 expectations. And all I did is say, well, that's very similar to the JET paper with Mai Zhu in 2014. So I don't know how Sebastian actually came up with that theory, but the idea of the theoretical learning model is the key part of a learning model is you have to assume what is called a perceived law of motion. And here, there's just a very simple assumption that everybody has a simple AR1 rule in whatever needs to be forecasted in the economy. And that is a rule that works pretty well because it has the sample average correct and it has the first order persistent coefficient correct. So that is a simple rule that does remarkably well. I'm actually not sure how Sebastian came up, why he did come up with the AR1.
Sebastian, do you want to?
Yes, I'm thinking so.
Right, okay. Well, you can come back on that one. Megan Green has a question. I think Megan has been connected. So Megan, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that presentation. I was just wondering when you showed the actual data versus what the agent-based model predicted, it seemed like for all the components of GDP, the actual data was more volatile. Is that inevitable? Or why is that?
Was it maybe slightly more volatile? So this probably means, yeah, that the model is still not perfect and we're missing something, but I don't have good intuition now for how to better answer this question.
Maybe I can jump in here quickly. I think the AR1 process is smoothing a lot. So you project the past trends and you don't catch all the ups and downs of the trend. So you have maybe similar to a DSGE model, but with a different expectation mechanism, a kind of smoothing function. That's my intuition to it. I don't know, Sebastian, if you agree to that.
Yeah, and we can, I think it's only slightly, so I can share the screen. Once more, so we're not missing much, I think.
But I also found it interesting how the DSG model, it's in the later years that it moves further away from the outcomes. So it's really our performance comes in the later years, not the earlier years.
Yes.
Tony Curzon Price has a question. Is Tony able to come in? It doesn't appear so. Let me ask it. Tony asks, what is the mechanism of the endogenous crisis in the model?
So the key mechanism that drives endogenous crisis in the model is a financial accelerator mechanism and debt finance investment in the model. We basically have a feedback between the financial and the real economy that manifests itself as a negative feedback between the financial conditions of firms and asset prices. And then this leads to this endogenous crisis in the model.
Okay, and one final question from me. The simulation you did for the pandemic, what exact date did you do that? And what was the trigger for the big downturn that you'd managed to simulate in that simulation?
So in Austria, the pandemic hit in March 2020, when I remember correctly. And the very first hard data that came out was labor market data after a few weeks of the lockdown. And we used this labor market data as a proxy for the shock. And then with that shock, we ran the simulations for 3 years ahead.
So in April, I guess, is the answer.
In April, yeah.
Very impressive, yeah. Great, thank you very much indeed, Sebastian, Michael and Kars, and congratulations again. It's a great paper. We're going to move on to the second paper now. There will be some time at the end for further discussion where we can come back to some of these issues. So for the second presentation, I'm going to pass over to Valentina Semenova, who is going to present her work with Julian Winkler. So Valentina, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Dr. Armstrong, for the fine introduction, to Dr. Poledna for the inspiring presentation, and for everyone who has joined us here today. Julian Winkler and myself are both truly humbled to be here. Today, I'll be speaking about our joint work on contagion amongst investors, titled Reddit's Self-Organized Bull Runs. And before we jump into some of the meat of the presentation, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank our supervisors, Dawn Farmer, Xiaowen Dong, Rick Vanderplug, for their excellent guidance in our work, and also just to thank the INET community for all of their help and support throughout our research. And so, with no further ado, I will go ahead and share my screen. Great. So I'd like to start off by speaking about the general context for our research. Social media has had a profound impact on society. Over 4.2 billion people, or 50% of the world's population, are active social media users. And here I highlight some of the documented consequences of this phenomena. So a powerful study out of MIT in 2018 found that fake news travels online several times faster than real news. Simultaneously, social media has been documented to contribute to polarization in society. And finally, increased use of social media has driven privacy and civil liberty concerns, especially in conjunction with things like the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And so with that in mind, Julian and myself couldn't help but ask what this means for investment. After all, if we consider the quote from Nobel laureate Robert Shiller in 1984, he says that investing in speculative assets is a social activity. And so while asking this question, we turned to the Wall Street Bets Forum. We started looking into this in the beginning of 2020, and perhaps at this point, with the GameStop short squeeze and various other volatility we've observed, studying the Wall Street Bets Forum might be more acceptable. But at the time, you might have asked, what made us decide to study this funky forum with this strange Trump character and also Leonardo DiCaprio sipping a glass of wine? And the answer here is actually quite simple. The forum has garnered an unprecedented following. So at this point in time, there are over 10 million people who turn to Wall Street Bets to seek investment advice and enter into discussions about potential investment opportunities. And here on the right-hand side, I plot the growth of the forum since its inception in 2012. And you can see the forum is growing exponentially as this is plotted on a logarithmic scale. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar with Reddit or Wall Street Bets, this is the way the forum is structured. People will submit posts in which they present some topic for discussion, potentially about prospective investment opportunities, and then other people will come in and comment, enter into discussion about the initial post, and kind of engage in conversation. And posts will sometimes have reference to a ticker or a tradable asset. Going forward in the presentation, I will use the term ticker, stock, and asset interchangeably to refer to tradable financial instruments. And one other aspect that Julian and myself found quite encouraging about this Wall Street Bets Forum was the fact that people not only post these kind of discussions, but they also actually go ahead and post their gains and losses on the forum. And for us, this was quite encouraging, because this means people not only engage in conversation and chat about potential investments, but actually put their money where their mouth is, meaning that they follow through and follow this investment advice. And so with that in mind, we went ahead with the following hypothesis: that retail investors influence each other's interest in stocks and sentiments about stocks, net of outside factors, such as stock volatility and performance. And kind of the underlying hypothesis moves slightly away from traditional economic theory, saying that investors will base all of their decisions on fundamentals. And this is in contrast kind of the null hypothesis, that retail investors' interests in stocks are entirely driven by exogenous influence, i.e. stock price movements or news, and that they have no influence on each other. And so with this kind of framework in mind, we have two pieces to our presentation for you today. First, I'm going to speak about what behavior we actually observed on the Wall Street Bets Forum. And after that, I'm going to dive into how the behavior on Wall Street Bets relates to actual asset prices. But first, let's dig into the first question. So when studying the observed behavior on Wall Street Bets, we focused on two key components: contagion, which unfortunately at this point, I think we are all much too familiar with, but essentially the underlying idea behind contagion is that an initial set of users who are enthusiastic about an investment opportunity in a stock then succeed at attracting a greater and greater following. And then after this, I'll speak about consensus, which discusses whether people come to an agreement about the direction in which the stock will move. Now, when speaking about contagion, we pursued two different approaches to verify whether contagion occurs on Wall Street Bets. One is a regression-based approach, which you can read about on our paper draft online, and a matching on observables approach, which I will focus on today. And the key idea behind this matching on observables approach is to isolate a treatment effect. So essentially to understand the mechanism through which an initial group converts more and more followers to become excited about prospective investment opportunities. Now, before I jump into these results from our contagion observations, I'd like to first show you how discussions about specific assets, so here I list 4 popular tickers on the Wall Street Bets forum, develop over time. And here you can see that a lot of these discussions have this hump-shaped pattern. And perhaps this is reminiscent of more traditional epidemiological contagion, as people become diseased and then after that recover, and in our particular case, move on to seek other investment opportunities. Now, I'll turn course slightly and discuss what we mean by treatment. So in more traditional medical context, when we talk about treatment, we speak of something like a pill or a shot that a patient might be exposed to, and we want to observe whether they recover from a disease. Now, in the social context, when I'm talking about a treatment, I'm talking about exposure to some social interaction or social event. And in this particular case, what we're interested in studying is individuals' exposure to a post about a specific ticker proposing very specific investment advice within the Wall Street Bets context. And so ideally, if we are to study this from a treatment effect perspective, we would be able to take an individual at a point in time, expose them to a treatment, aka expose them to a post about a stock, and then observe an effect. And then we would go back to that same point in time, change only the fact that we don't expose them to the treatment, and again, observe the effect. Now, of course, we're not really able to do that for many reasons. And so instead we have to do the next best thing, which is a matching on observables exercise, where we take an individual who has been exposed to a treatment, aka has interacted with a post about a stock, and then we find someone who looks very similar to them by all other characteristics, meaning they have very similar behavior on the Wall Street Bets forum, and they have similar behavior externally. So they engage in very similar other subreddits. And we look at them at that same point in time, but again, these are people who do not comment. So they are people who are not exposed to this social treatment effect. And we compare the outcome across these 2 groups of individuals. Now, one thing that's important to consider in social dynamics is the fact that a single treatment, so engaging in a single source of social interaction, may be less powerful than engaging with multiple people. So for example, if I speak to one person and they tell me GameStop stock is a really great thing, that might have some effect on me. But if I have many people repeating this to me and I discuss the prospects with them, I might see a much larger effect. And so in order to capture that, we break down the treatments into different categories, depending on how much exposure an individual has received within the Wall Street Bets forum. And the key result from our contagion work is captured within this chart, where we look at the difference in the probability of an individual to create a post about a stock in the treatment group versus the control group after they've been exposed to previous posts about that same stock. And the results here are quite encouraging, where firstly, the difference is positive, meaning that engagement in conversations on the forum about stocks does in fact have a positive and contagious effect. Another thing that is interesting is the fact that we observe this increased effect with larger and larger treatments, implying some form of complex contagion and implying that repeated engagement in conversations has a larger and larger effect. Now that we've been able to establish contagion on the forum, I'd like to switch gears a little bit and discuss consensus. And the idea here is, so we might all agree that Apple is an interesting stock to consider, but if we engage in discussions with each other, can we agree on the direction in which this stock will move in the future? And so in order to study this, we look at a temporal network analysis on the sentiment expressed by individuals in their respective posts. And so in order to extract sentiment, we use a pre-trained BERT classifier on a manually labeled set of posts. To give you some intuition about what we're trying to do here, I explain this through a toy network construction, where first we have an individual who might create a post about a stock, expressing positive sentiments, saying it's great. We have a set of individuals who comment on this initial post, some of whom might go on and create posts themselves. What we're interested in this particular case is isolating this network effect, the effect that the initial individual has on future posts generated by commenters. And here on the right-hand side, I display to you the network that we construct. So here I'd like to draw your attention to some of our key results. First, I'd like to discuss our baseline model. So our baseline model actually doesn't look at the network effects, but includes some other variables, such as stock returns and volatility, and also the author's previous activity. And the hypothesis here is that if you see a stock doing well, you might feel more compelled that the stock will do well in the future. And perhaps if it's doing poorly, you again might post negative things. And also, this previous author sentiment is something that I perhaps call stubbornness. And hence I have this funky display of a person with a donkey. And the idea here is that people perhaps are stubborn and do not really want to change their opinion over time. And the results here are quite intuitive. So if a stock is performing positively, this means that people are less likely to post something negative, where our dependent variables are the log odds of expressing either positive or negative sentiment in the future. Similarly, the results are intuitive in terms of the previous author sentiment, where if somebody has posted positive sentiment in the past, they're less likely to post negative sentiment, more likely to post positive sentiment. Now, you might be asking yourself, you've shown me this table of coefficients, but what do these numbers actually mean? So let's zoom into this coefficient here, which shows that if somebody has posted something positive in the past, they're around 46% less likely to express negative sentiment over neutral. So with that in mind, I'd like to move on and capture these network effects. So within the network effects, we are looking at what types of posts the individual author has commented on in the past, and we're trying to find how that affects their posts in the future. And so what we find is also quite interesting, where if somebody has commented on negative posts in the past, they're more likely to post negatively in the future, less likely to post positively, and the effect is reversed for positive engagement with positive posts. And one thing I'd like to draw your attention to that we found quite interesting is the fact that this effect is not symmetric. So if you engage with positive posts in the past, you are actually, you are kind of slightly less, the impact of the positive is slightly less than the negative, and perhaps implying some degree of panic spread throughout this investor network. And we have several other network models we test, which I encourage you to look at within our paper if you are interested in. And so now we've established some proof for contagion in the Wall Street Bets Forum and for consensus forming among investors on the Wall Street Bets Forum. Now, one of the questions you might be asking me is, well, what does this actually mean for stock prices? How did this lead perhaps to this GameStop short squeeze and the gradual rise of several other assets and the volatility we've observed in the market thus far? And we try and tackle this question with a twofold approach. So first, we propose an asset pricing model, which is which incorporates this contagion and consensus behavior among investors. And then we run a simulation based on this model and kind of observe the dynamics that occur. And the second thing that we do, which I'll speak about a little bit later, is we tie Wall Street Bets dynamics. We use them as an indicator for future market indicators. And so with that in mind, I'd like to introduce you to our asset pricing model, where what we say is that asset price, where we have asset price times the total shares, is potentially governed by the demand from hype investors, so investors who are affected by social interaction, and other investor demand who are not affected by this social phenomena. And so we propose a model and discuss it at length within our paper online, where these hype investors are going to be governed by contagion and by consensus. And so what I'd like to share with you today is what happens when we simulate our proposed model in terms of the observed price dynamic in the asset these hype investors choose to invest in. And what we observe is a steady run-up in price, a slow but steady run-up in price over the course of several time steps as this contagion dynamic occurs. But then, as investors begin to doubt the value of their initial investment, panic spreads, and we see this prolonged period of volatility, which occurs afterward. Now, we find this actually quite encouraging because this is similar to what we've observed overall in the markets in terms of the influx of these new hype investors from Wall Street Bets. So with that in mind, you might be asking, well, this is all very nice. It's quite interesting to observe the dynamics that occur from simulation, but what about the real market variables? And so in order to answer this question, we pursue a two-stage least squares regression approach, which demonstrates a relationship between discussions on Wall Street Bets and asset trading volumes. And so our two SLS model is composed of the following two regressions, where first what we try and do is we use user activity in assets that occurs previously on Wall Street Bets in combination with asset returns to predict new user interest. And then we use our prediction, so this estimated user activity, in conjunction with historical average sentiment from Wall Street Bets, in order to try and predict some market variable. And so our results are highlighted here, where we think the most powerful results come from our ability to explain variation in stock trading volumes. And perhaps the best way to look at this is through a picture, as a picture is worth 1,000 words, where we plot here the demeaned trading volume that is actually observed in the market versus our prediction of trading volume from Wall Street Bets activity. And of course, we don't capture the trend precisely, but we do notice that we capture some of these important upticks and downticks in terms of volume within the market. Another important thing to highlight from this plot is that we really do see this contagious activity, this buildup of hype, and then this subsequent drop of interest in terms of trading volumes for these two example stocks here. Now, with that, I'd like to say that this research and these findings do have some potential important implications, both on the macroeconomy as a whole, because the stock market is a valuable source of funding, and also might perhaps change the current view of investors and the way that we model investors and actors in the market. So with that, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that Julian and my work is now on archive. And if you have any interest, please go ahead, read it, get in touch with us. We're always open to discussion and such. And I'd like to open the floor for any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Valentina. I mean, one of the reasons why we particularly like this paper is because one of the main areas that rebuilding macro is coming down to is the idea of direct interaction between agents being the sort of crucial missing part of macroeconomics for the last 60 or so years. That's how we get these coordination issues, which I guess is what these bubble effects really are that you're talking about. Let me ask any of your co-panelists or anybody in the audience if they have any questions they would like to put to you. But first of all, is this the only platform, is Reddit the only platform that you can do this, that you have this information?
So you do have something called stock tweets, and you have several other areas where you have people discussing stocks in this kind of socially aggregated way. But I think that Wall Street Bets is the first place that we've really seen such a large scale coordination mechanism occurring.
Right. Very good, very good. Any questions for Valentina?
I think Professor Holmes has a raised hand, but I might be wrong.
Yeah, thank you. You are right. I have a question.
Yeah.
I have a general question. I'm just wondering, in models with contagion or models with reinforcement learning, both can lead to the same effect of bubbles and very coordination on bubbles. So how would you distinguish in the data whether the behavior comes from contagion following each other, or whether the behavior is driven from just switching to better performing strategies? Do you have a way to distinguish between that?
That's a good question. I guess the question becomes whether or not, in some ways, perhaps the better performing strategy is coordination among the investors, right? The ability for, as we combine and more people join this movement, we'll have more market impact to drive this idea up, to drive a particular stock up. But I guess the way that we would be able to potentially distinguish is the fact that these are not necessarily singular strategies, but more expressing interest in just a single stock, if that makes sense. So I think that that's kind of the hypothesis behind it. But if there's, I guess if you have some examples of how you would think between the two of them.
Well, for example, you can think of a simple trend following strategy. If the majority has coordinated on the simple trend following strategy, that could be the reason why they are in the same stock. Another explanation could be they heard from their neighbors that they are in the same stock and they do it for that reason. And it's kind of difficult to distinguish between those mechanisms. And I was just wondering whether you have any way with your data to tackle this point.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we tackle this in the regression approach in our contagion section, where we essentially also kind of include a variable for stock performance. And we find that that is, of course, significant for predicting this contagion effect. But the actual user count is also predictive for attracting new users. So when controlled for market variables and perhaps trend following due to recent stock performance, the contagion variable remains kind of impactful and significant for prediction.
Okay, so you probably have both effects in the market.
Yeah, certainly. I think that that makes a lot of sense to think about that in those two ways.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kaz. Kaz, just there's a follow-up from Michael Hatch to you in the chat, a question about one of the replies you just gave. We have a question from Tony Curzon-Price. Tony, can you?
Yeah, this time around I can. I thought that was really, really fascinating, Valentina. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
So maybe I didn't catch this. At the beginning, you said that some of the forum posters posted what they actually then did in terms of trading. Did you try to use any of that data? And because it seems to me one of the really kind of key questions in general, using these questions of belief transmission, is how does belief translate into action? And this seems like potentially a really nice data source to look at that. Did you try looking at that?
Yeah, so we have scraped a database of these screenshots, and we've essentially tried to extract the tickers that people mention in these screenshots. It's relatively a small sample as compared to the number of posts people make expressing kind of interest. But I think in some ways it's a slightly different paper, and one that we are considering pursuing, answering this question, like tying the discussions to actual kind of number of posts that people make. But definitely something we are interested in, and happy to discuss further if there's some overlapping interest as well.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Marco. Marco, I think you can speak directly.
There was this very nice plot with outbreaks of different stocks. Upon thinking about it, I think your model only has one stock, so maybe it was a stupid question to ask whether you could have this type of outbreaks reproduced by your model. But have you just thought in going in the direction of reproducing that fact? That was fascinating, I thought.
Yeah, thanks so much, Marco. So we have actually done that, where we've initialized for these different stocks, and as you say, this epidemic like outbreak curve, we have initialized the model from the forum parameters kind of towards the beginning of the outbreak, and we are able to reproduce kind of the shape and a similar kind of trend over time. So that was encouraging for us.
Great, thank you very much indeed. There's a couple of other questions in the chat, so perhaps between you and Julian, you can respond to those directly. But we'll move on to our third presentation now, if that's okay, just to keep everything in time. So Anton, good to see you. And you have 20 minutes to present your paper. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So let me share the screen. So you should now be able to see my slides.
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. So I think I have to say like similar as the other presenters before. I think in the name of the whole group, I've worked on this project. I'm very humbled to be here today, and so big thanks to the organizers to actually give the opportunity for a complexity macroeconomics research prize, and also for setting up this conference. I'm really delighted to present our work today. So you see here on the title slide, basically the title of our research paper, which I have submitted for the Rebuilding Macroeconomics Complexity Prize. But I have to say that this work was really like one piece of a larger project, which we started on working on when the COVID-19 pandemic started, but really took on very extreme conditions in the early last year. So what I'm giving you today is a presentation of this particular piece of research, but also providing some more context of actually what guided us in this research. And I'll also give you a little bit of a teaser of current work, which we are doing right now, where we try to extend our current model, which we have. And I also have to mention that this is really not, the research effort of myself only, but this was really part of a larger group with Marco, who is here today as well, Maria, Francois, and Dawn, all from INET, Oxford, or Marco, who is actually in Pisa now, and who have contributed to our COVID-19 related research. So as I said, this is a larger research project where we tried to understand and quantify the economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we had our troubles with existing models, and so we developed our own set of new models, which were tailored specifically at the current pandemic situation. So a very early paper, which I will also tell you a little bit more about in the next slides, was actually trying to derive these first order shocks. So in order to quantify macroeconomic impacts of a natural disaster, such as a pandemic, you need some first order shocks to actually initialize a model with, right? And so then the second set of work we have done is actually trying to develop such a model where we can try to track the macroeconomic consequences of the COVID pandemic over time. And we are currently working on an extension of our input-output model, where we actually make it more agent-based than it is now, and try to make it more granular as well. So here we apply it to the New York metropolitan area, and we work together with a group of epidemiologists to really get better feedback dynamics of both the epidemiological and the economics. So first, let me recap a bit of what we think is the key features of the current, current is maybe not right anymore, but of the pandemic in early 2020. So when countries like the United Kingdom, which was the focus of our research, started with lockdowns, we could see the following. There were severe supply shocks due to mandated lockdowns. Firms were not able to operate. So some people could not work either on site or did not have the opportunity to work remotely. We also could observe quite severe demand shocks. So not just lower aggregate demand, but also a change in preferences. So for example, there was a shift away from public transportation. We also think that that in the lockdown, the economic system is not in a new equilibrium. So it, in particular in the first wave we experienced, most countries got hit quite unexpectedly. And so there was the economic system hit by a massive shock, and arguably it takes time for such a large complex system to approach a new state which one could consider as an equilibrium. And we also think that supply chain coordination issues played a major role, and this is also confirmed by quite some empirical evidence. And there's also some trade-off between epidemic spreading and economic consequences. And this is what we now actually zoom into more detail in the current. So the paper, what I'm presenting today, is an introduction of a new dynamic input-output model where inventories are explicitly featured, and it's modeled out of equilibrium, and we also introduce a new form of production function. So as said, we first, in order to initialize our model, we need first order shocks, and shocks actually took place on both sides, on the supply and the demand side of the economic system. And so how did we come up with supply shocks? So in our first paper, we were actually developing the concept of the remote labor index, where we have coded work activities based on whether they can be done remotely or not. And those work activities, we then mapped into occupations and further into industries. And from this, we derived our first order shocks, or our industry level remote labor index. We also took national lists of essential industries. So, for example, there were some industries which were considered to be essential, whereas others, such as restaurants, were actually mandated to be closed. And as a combination of those, so we computed our supply shocks. So workers that could not work from home and were not working in those essential industries were actually those which were removed from the labor force, and our supply shocks are proportional to this removal of labor inputs. So our demand shocks, we took a more crude approach here due to the lack of fine-grained data, and we adapted a prospective study of the congressional budget office where they deal explicitly with demand side effects of the pandemic. And so just a quick summary. So certain industries, such as transport, were considered essential, so there were no supply shocks, but people did travel less, so there were severe demand shocks. For other industries, it was the other way around, or other industries, such as restaurants, were actually hit hard on both sides, the supply and the demand side. So when doing this and mapping demand shocks against supply shocks, this is the picture that we observe. So some industries actually experience very little first order shocks in terms of demand and supply. Some experience much larger demand shocks than supply shocks. And here, for example, transport is the opposite example. All right, so that's our first order shocks. We then tried to plug into a macroeconomic model, and this is now the focus of the presentation now. So as we know that these first order shocks is not actually what the total shocks are. They might be amplified due to the production networks. And so we would expect both upstream and downstream effects from those first order shocks. But then there's also further mechanisms such as Keynesian mechanisms. So for example, if workers are losing their jobs, or if they are afraid of losing their jobs, they might actually reduce their demand for different types of goods. And as we also find is that inventory holdings play a major role in shock amplification, and that also the types of inputs you're using in the production process might play a critical role in terms of shock amplification. As said, our model tries to take into account both types of shocks, demand shocks and supply shocks. So that's already something in many macroeconomic models it's difficult to deal with. But because we think there's heterogeneity in both types of shocks, it's really important to take them into account explicitly. So it's just a description in words of what we're doing. So I'm not showing the equations in detail here, but I just try to give you an impression of what we tried to achieve with this type of model. So in our demand side module, consumer demand is depending on preferences, but also on their income and their expectations of future income. And industries hold input inventories, and they try to maintain those. And we worked quite hard to actually calibrate them to detailed data from the ONS. On the supply side, we had different types of constraints for economic production. So the productive capacity, for example, is proportional to labor input, which then is subject to supply shocks due to lockdown measures. There's also the possibility of input bottlenecks playing a role in economic production. So we apply a Leontief type of production function, but only for critical inputs. And I'll tell you in a second how we actually differentiate between different types of inputs and how we assess them to be critical or not to be critical. And in our model, there's also the possibility of unsatisfied demand. So it might be the case that firms are actually receiving more orders than they are able to produce. In this case, they need to ration their consumers. So that's a few of the key mechanisms that we try to implement, or that we have implemented in our model framework. So as I said, we tried to get a fairly realistic depiction of industry level production, and the type of production function will play a major role here. And but it was also clear to us, well, if you now shut down restaurants, you would not expect that the, let's say, steel industry would suffer immediate big losses as a consequence, although restaurants actually inputs, if you look at the input-output tables, to the steel industry. So we tried to get a better, more granular picture of the criticality of different types of inputs. And so we set out by conducting a survey where we were asking industry specialists about whether certain inputs for different industries are actually critical in their production. And so explicitly we are asking them, can production continue in industry X if input Y is not available for 2 months? So we were really asking also for 2 months. This is a very short-term picture of economic production. So this was really trying to get an understanding of what matters in the short run. And so here you see different industries on the x-axis and the inputs on the y-axis. And the color codes tell you whether certain goods are critical or not critical. And blue means critical inputs and white means non-critical. And so here you see quite some heterogeneity of input criticality for different industries. So once the model is set out and calibrated and initialized, we can actually do predictions. And so that's what we did early on last year, making predictions of GDP and also other macroeconomic aggregate variables for the second quarter of 2020. And so that's basically a picture showing you how these predictions look like for gross output, which are normalized to be 1 before the pandemic. And then you see the time horizon on the x-axis. And so the thick black line shows you the aggregate predicted output level. And you also see that this system is not really in equilibrium. It's a transient we are looking at. And you also see that for different industries, we get quite different output levels. So very different macroeconomic impact as a consequence of the first order shocks. And so basically we did our predictions early on before the actual data came out. So we were making predictions not just out of tempo, but also out ahead of time. And now we had the chance to actually have a look at our predictions, which turned out to be quite accurate. And we tried now to get a better understanding of what were actually the main factors driving those predictions. So why did we get it that right? What is the point which we can improve also for the future? So to learn also for future predictions. So in May 2020, we predicted that GDP will fall by 21.5% compared to 2019. And this turned out to be quite accurate. And also compared with other forecasts, we did remarkably well. And also to show you, we did not just predict GDP, our model is also able to predict other types of important macroeconomic variables, such as consumption, investment, but also wages and profits. And so what was it that we did so well? So I think an honest answer also needs to include the first point I mentioned here, that aggregation plays a role. So on the sectoral level, it's much harder to do good predictions, and sectoral errors are larger, around 10 to 12%. But by aggregation, they actually average out. But that's not the whole story. It also depends a lot on what type of production module you have in your in your model, and also how you initialize your model with. So basically, what we find out exposed is that we really got the sweet spot right between shock severity on the one hand and the production function rigidity on the other hand. And so in our new paper version, we are looking into more detail of these different types of trade-offs in the model and trying to understand the effects on our economic predictions. And it should be also mentioned that we found that the assumption of the production function played a major role, and especially for industry level Leontief type of production function, we found very unrealistic time patterns. So here you just see a plot of the actual data versus the model predictions for different industries. And you also see that overall, well, the data is quite well correlated, so that's good. But are these predictions now good or bad? And to be honest, it's actually hard to answer, because there's not many papers out there which are, well, let's say that brave to show the industry level predictions. It's very easy to get on the detailed level predictions very wrong, and it's very hard to get them right. And we tried to benchmark our predictions with other predictions as well, but the honest answer is that there's not many predictions to benchmark with. And so I think also it would be important for future research to actually go a bit more into detailed industry level predictions and see whether the model is not just getting the aggregate right, which will be which might be also due to aggregation issues, but whether the model is actually also giving sensible results on the more fine-grained industry level. So, and with the last, I think, 2 minutes I have left, I just give you a quick teaser of our current project, where we try to extend this work to better study the coupled effects of epidemiology and economics. And so what we're doing there, we have actually teamed up with a group of epidemiologists and calibrated our economic model, but also an epidemiological model to a synthetic population from the United States, actually from the New York metropolitan area. And so on the economic side, we are using a regionalized version of the input-output model I've talked before. And we are simplifying a little bit the production module. But on the other hand, we are zooming much more into the details of the consumer side. So we are relaxing the assumption of representative consumer, but we have a lot of different demographic variables for individuals. So for example, we have the aged income groups, occupations, different industries, and so on and so forth. And in this model, people are quarantined if anyone in the household is positive, so then they cannot go to work. So this will have economic consequences. And also people's consumption depends negatively on death and infection rates. And in terms of the epidemiological model, we build mostly on Alberto Aleta and others, which is already published. So here's just a quick graphical visualization of our model. We have different types of individuals, which basically can meet each other in different types of activities, like work activities, here the red lines, or we might go shopping or go to the restaurants. And we also make the economic relationships with input-output data explicit. And so in order to do so, we actually need to pool a lot of different data sets, which we calibrate our epidemic and economic model with. And there's also feedback dynamics from the epidemic model to the economic. All right, and so here's just a few early results to show you what we are trying to do here. So here we see basically model and model predictions and also data for employment and consumption for different income groups. And what we observed is that low income groups actually hit harder in terms of employment, also consumption of the pandemic. And our model is reproducing those patterns. Here you see infections per 1,000 individuals over time for different occupational groups. And just to also give you a sense that we are trying to make explicit the epidemiological dynamics of the pandemic. And our model is spatially explicit, as is shown here, where we show different employment levels as predicted by our model for different localities of the New York metropolitan area. All right, so with this, let me thank you for your attention. And if there's any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Thank you very much indeed, Anton. That was great. I just have a question on the second last slide that you showed. You showed, I think, the drop in income for high and low income households. That's a big difference between them.
Right. So
Right.
that's correct.
Why
So you're
is that
referring to the model or to the data?
To this model, the data on the left. Well, the data. It's the data below, and above it is the modeled estimate.
Yeah, exactly. So I should mention that the data here is from credit card transaction data. So we are not able to actually like use those data as a proper benchmark. We rather took it as a qualitative benchmark to see whether our model is giving the same ranking of different income groups in the way we are hit by the pandemic. And so it's reproducing these types of patterns, but this is not aggregate like real national accounting data we're comparing. But maybe I should also let Marco give an answer to this, because he's really the brain behind the extension of this work. So maybe Marco, you want to add something?
Sure.
I just wanted to add that actually there is this interesting pattern discovered in multiple papers, including the ones about by opportunity insights in the US, led by Raj Chetty, that in this pandemic was a very strange recession, in the sense that poor people reduced were hit most in terms of employment, but they also reduced consumption the least. And you can see that in this plot, as the red line and the blue line have, are inverted in the employment versus consumption panels. And I think we are, to my knowledge, the only ones reproducing this empirical pattern. And this is because basically, well, the poor were hit more because they were working in industries that were hit hard, but they were also spending a higher share of their income on essential stuff, such as housing. If you look at the poorest people, they spend 50% of their income on housing, and they still had to pay their rent. So this is just an example of doing the types of results that you can get with a very granular and very well calibrated model, in the sense that the consumption data really come from surveys. So really, we are distinguishing between 42 different age income groups in terms of their different spending patterns. And so this result really comes from the very detailed micro level calibration of the consumption choices.
Right, that's very interesting. And one of the things that I particularly liked about, I think one of the first versions of your model, you were able to say, well, if you were to open up sectors of the economy first, which sectors would you start opening up? Which I think the paper came out in June. Your first draft I saw, I think, was beginning of June. So this was a very live question at the time. Do you want to just make a couple of comments about what your suggestions were?
Right. So I think the paper came out, I think it was still May, actually. So in time before the actual first lockdown was relaxed. So this was really a question we were interested in by ourselves. And in our first version of the model, we had a simpler epidemiological model than we are having now. And so one has also, to have these caveats in mind, that we had to do major simplifications in those types of modeling. But basically what we found was that it makes sense to start basically upstream industries first. So we found large positive effects from opening upstream industries, whereas there is comparatively small effects on small negative effects on the epidemic spreading. So that was a trade-off we observed, and so in the first version of the paper we tried to nail down a bit better where this sweet spot could be. And so so basically, for the first pandemic, it's the situation back then, we found that it made sense to keep consumer-facing industries closed while opening more upstream ones. And so this actually kept in our modeling framework the epidemiological consequences within certain thresholds which we predetermined.
Yeah, which I thought at the time was a very creative and bold answer to a very pressing real-time question, which obviously a lot of lives depended were exactly about these sort of questions, which is why I think it was so important and such an attractive way to look at it, using these network elements. Are there further questions for Anton that anybody has? Tony, I see you were busy on the chat. Have your questions been answered?
Well, I was just busily typing one in response to this point about the real-time question at the time. So I do remember, being present in a lot of presentations in which models of this type, but not nearly as good as this one. I mean, I remember saying how at the time to colleagues how good this one was, and criticizing the kind of poor imitations from BCG or McKinsey that were being produced of these. And as Angus says, the crucial question at the time was, we want to move to a world of smart non-pharmaceutical interventions, and we want to minimize the economic effect. So how are we going to unpick this? But I'm also very struck by the fact that that whole discussion completely disappeared, right? And I'm just wondering whether you have any thoughts as to why it disappeared and what would be needed to be added to this kind of model to not make it disappear next time around.
That's a good question. Maybe Marco, you want to answer this, because I think this speaks directly to our new work.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, if I can share screen, I just wanted to show another very early result. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
So this is the type of work we're doing with the epidemiologists. So we really have a calibration where we can trace infections in the simulations down to the industry where they originated. And in the new work, we can then, so this is actually about New York, not about the UK, but still the dynamics is likely to be very similar. And we can in principle tell both the number of infections that happened in each high-level industry, as well as the share. And another visualization that we can look at is by bar plots, that maybe it's clearer. And you really see that there are really a few industries that account for a disproportionate amount of infections, such as retail, health, entertainment, and food and accommodation. Now, these are the so-called customer-facing industries that rightly in the second phase of the pandemic in the autumn were the ones that most countries focused on. No country in the autumn decided to close manufacturing, for instance, because manufacturing, because rightly, I think, they understood that it was a very suboptimal choice to close low offices or manufacturing plants. And so I guess that in some sense, the reason why the interest in that question went down is that there was kind of a consensus that focusing on customer-facing industries was the optimal choice in some sense. Although, of course, one could make even more targeted policies, such as opening only to 25% rate and so on. But okay, in general, to say, I think that to be as targeted as possible, there needs to be as better data as possible. There is this Nature paper that looks at really cell phone data and very detailed tracking. I think this is what we need to do: very detailed and very granular interventions.
That's great. Any other questions for either Marco or Anton? No, I don't think so. In which case, let me.
So I think Valentina is raising hands. Actually.
Oh, I beg your
Sorry.
pardon. I'm a terrible host. Excuse me.
No worries, no worries. I was just going to ask, I mean, I think constructing such a great network model takes so much effort and data and understanding. And so I'm kind of wondering what other vision you guys have except for this epidemiological use case, if there's kind of any other applications you're seeing further down the road.
Well, that's a big question. So I think the model itself would apply to other types of natural disasters. So in that sense, it's a very, well, I think it lines up quite nicely with classical disaster types of models. For my part, I'm actually now trying to make better environmental extensions of such models. So make more explicit of material base of production more explicit, as well as associated emissions with production. So that's another extension that I have in mind, but which will require also quite some extension of the current framework as well.
I guess, I mean, this brings to the connection to the final discussion. I really see an integration between the type of model that Sebastian presented in the beginning and the last model that we discussed. So, I mean, Sebastian didn't have occupations, income, heterogeneity. Well, income, I think you had, but not occupations in the sense of calibrated to the international classification of occupations and so on. So I guess that kind of merging in the two direction of fully fledged macro model with more granular household features could be an interesting extension.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. We have about 10 minutes left, so I just want to open up for questions on all three of the papers. That this is a bit of a free-for-all that anybody may have that have sort of come to mind. And I noticed that there was a question on the first paper that Marco, you raised earlier on in the chat, which is what happens to the dynamics of the model as you go further out? Does it become chaotic or does it settle down? Do you want to either sort of express your question, Marco, or are you happy with that?
It's okay, thanks.
Yeah, so Sebastian or your colleagues?
Yes, I'm a bit reluctant to run the model for, I think you said 30 years, if I remember correctly, something like that. So so I think there are too many processes missing in the model. So one would need to account for demographic changes, technological changes, and so on. But if you do it, if you run the model now, then it settles. I don't know, maybe Kars, do you want to comment a bit more?
Yes, I can make some general remarks about that. For this complex model, I don't know, but I trust Sebastian when he says that it is locally stable. My experience based on simpler models that have been fitted to data or even estimated on data. For example, we have estimated switching models with different strategies on data. And what you often find is that you find estimated parameters that are actually close to the first bifurcation, but that are still in the locally stable, steady state region. And I think that makes sense actually, because if you would, for that kind of nonlinear model, if you would be to see in the data, and even when you would be in a chaotic region, that also, if low dimensional chaos, still maybe too regular to what you see in the data. And so local stability seems to make more sense because that allows for the possibility of convergence of the model when the shocks are small, but then a few positive shocks, for example, can get a trend started, that can be amplified by the switching mechanism, and that can lead to a bubble solution until new shocks come in that sort of stabilize the bubble, and then it goes back to the neighborhood of the equilibrium. So that's all compatible with a locally stable steady state. And then the dynamics in the when you add shocks is really an interaction between things triggered by shocks, bubbles triggered by shocks, and amplified by the nonlinear mechanism, but not necessarily into real cyclic or chaotic motion.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Can I ask another question about the first paper? So this is the scale is basically 1-to-1 really for the Austrian economy, right? So I guess the population of Austria is, I think you said 14 million. I don't know if that was households or people. But to build one of these for, say, Germany or for the UK, what sort of time, sort of investment do you think that is? I mean, you know, this is going to greatly add to policymakers' toolkit, right? I mean, they're going to want to run several models. So how much is going to be involved in this?
To do that, so for a small open economy like Austria, you can still do it on like reasonably large servers that are available to many universities and institutes. And to scale the model up to make it useful for large economies, then you need to rely on larger clusters. I think I mentioned it in the end of my presentation. So for that, I partnered with a group that has expertise on high performance computing at the University of Tokyo. For that, so we invested in a new implementation of the model that targets these large supercomputers. And then it scales very nicely, and there are basically no limits on the economies that you can then study with the model. So we did our first versions for the Japanese economy, and then we also have a version for the Euro area, which are both large blocks, or in case of Japan, large economy.
Very good. Okay, any further questions that people would like to ask?
There is a question in the question and answer by Eric Decker.
Beg your pardon, where are we? In the Q&A or?
Yes.
Ah, there is.
So
yeah.
here's a question about...
Intellectually speaking, where are the current overlaps and differences between complexity and neoclassical schools of thought? Why don't I direct that one slightly to Professor Homs?
That's a difficult one, eh?
I know, that's why you're there.
You know, it depends on your definition on complexity. And there are 100 definitions of complexity. I think there is somewhere a paper out there that discusses definitions of complexity. If you have a mild definition like multiple equilibria, multiple steady states and nonlinearities, then that's also in neoclassical economics. So even under rational expectations, you can have multiple equilibria. So I think there is space for complexity even there. To me, what is important maybe is the non-rational expectations, non-rational behavior. And whether that is under heterogeneous agents, then you can have a very complex system. But even what Sebastian was explaining about our paper, the adaptive learning, a simple AL1 rule with updating of the parameters, leads to nonlinearities that can generate multiple equilibria. So you don't have to deviate very far from neoclassical economics to get complex dynamics or a complex system.
Great. Anybody would like to add to that?
Can I just add the observation as someone who's just watched the three presentations that, you know, the three presentations, it seemed to me, are very much in the tradition of economic modeling. I mean, there's nothing that, you know, whether a bit more micro than most macro, but it's very much in the tradition of all the tools that you'd see in economic modeling. I don't see a kind of deep divide here.
Well, I suppose let's think about this. So there's a lot of questions that need to be answered, like what this means for efficiency and welfare theorems and so on, just because it settles down nicely. So once we start allowing interactions, you get into some quite interesting questions about the properties and learning. You know, learning, is it now the most efficient? So I think that it raises some secondary questions which start opening up the idea of the usual welfare properties of an equilibrium.
So I think what we didn't really discuss in macro, but what is very important in standard macro is infinite horizon optimization.
Yeah.
And you know, a lot of that traditional macro makes these assumptions about infinite horizon optimization. Well, that's a very strong and my view is that's a very abstract notion. It is questionable whether people really can have infinite horizon maximization. So that's an important step. On the other hand, by what do you replace it? That's another question that is not easy to answer. But I think in this group of young people, there are many ideas, many models, many complexity approaches that can be very fruitful in macro and finance.
Absolutely. And on that note, it's 4 o'clock exactly. And the 3 papers that we've had, you know, the first one very much about forecasting with an extraordinary sort of one-to-one scale model. The second one that really brought out the importance of social interaction, which is everything that humans do. And then the third one, looking at this very impressive network model to answer, you know, life and death questions, frankly, almost in real time. And I remember reading the paper thinking, this is quite incredible at this moment to receive this, all of which show the power of these competing approaches to these more traditional approaches to doing macroeconomics. And I think the key here is also data and computing power, which now open up all of these possibilities, which clearly weren't there 30, 40 years ago. So can I just, in closing, thank everybody for attending and for your comments and contributions. And can I also thank everybody who entered the competition. As I say, we very much hope to be doing it next year. It will depend a little bit on our own status, but we very much hope that we'll be able to do it next year. And finally, to congratulate the fortunate winners for your great work and all of your determination to get to this point that you've reached in terms of doing this research. And it's been very encouraging and heartening to listen to all of the presentations. So thank you very much indeed. And please do stay very much in touch with Rebuilding Macroeconomics. We've got a long way to go yet, but it's great working with you all. And so thank you on behalf of Rebuilding Macroeconomics and the National Institute. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for organizing this.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.